Okay, so this is the that was an extended trailer as you get for movies. That was an extended trailer, not a 2-minute trailer, but I think that gives you a very high level understanding of what functions are and how they work. And as was mentioned, the goal here is now I want to dive into the anatomy of a function. Okay, so here, let me come pull up these slides. We're going to go through all the different parts of a function. And when I do this, I always use this example. This actually comes from the publisher, but in fact, when you look at many textbooks, often they'll use the same exact example, with the intention being, if I were to ask you what is the maximum between two numbers, 10 and 12, I don't need to explain to you how that's going to work. So if I were to come back over to here, let me hit stop. I come to my module 6 notes. If I were to say, what is the max of, 10 and 12? You would say the answer is 12. Max of 16 and 9, you would say 16. You don't need any explanation of, we've already covered that previously, but still it's pretty clear what's going on. And even under the hood, if I were to ask you to code that, you would probably be able to code that function without much effort, okay? And so we use that example intentionally because we want to cover the anatomy of a function on a simple example that we can all relate to, that makes sense for us. It's within our comfort zone. And if we then understand that example clearly and understand the anatomy, it then maps into or translates into any other function. So here is the overall anatomy of a function, and we're going to cover each part. So the function header is exactly what you see here. And can you confirm for me, Ibrahim, do you see my mouse moving when I show this PowerPoint screen?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thank you. So here, the function header is what you see here boxed in. It includes the word define, which is abbreviated for DEF. You then have the name of the function, in this case, max. You then have a list of parameters, which are specifically called formal parameters. I call them almost like placeholders. And that is the entire function header, the define, the name of the function, and then the list of parameters. That's the function header, okay? The formal parameters are what you see here in these blue boxes, num1 and num2. These are called formal parameters, and as I mentioned, think of them as placeholders, okay? Because a function is coded in a very generic fashion. As we just showed you on that last example of some numbers print, we coded that function very generically, right? But then when we called it, so here I said some numbers print num1, num2, but then I called it with a different set of numbers each time, right? So same idea is those are called placeholders, these formal parameters, where we're going to be sending into those placeholders. Bear with me, my video's not on. We're going to be sending into those placeholders these values that we're sending over to the function. Find the max of 10 and 12. Well, I'm going to throw over the 10 into num1, and then I throw over the 12 into num2, okay? Those are the formal parameters versus the actual parameters over here. So what I want you to see is, let me come to my annotate. So here, consider this to be where we're calling our function from, okay? So this right here is where we're actually calling that function. So imagine we have in our main working area of the program, if I had said max of 8, 5, hypothetically, if I had done that. Well, this is the actual values that I want to find the maximum between them. Okay, that's why they're called the actual parameters. And this actual value 8, it's going to get sent over to num1, which is our formal parameter. Okay, it's a placeholder. Num1 or num2 right here. What is num2? What is its value? You should say, I don't know, because num2 is just a generic variable to serve as a placeholder to catch. Think of, you see me catching, to catch the value that you're going to throw to me, right? So when we take this 5 and we throw it over and it gets sent over to num2, which is the placeholder where we're going to store that 5, okay? So this is the idea. So here's the actual function, and then over here is where we're calling that function. So here we're calling the function and we're sending over 2 actual values, the 8 and the 5. And the actual value 8 gets sent over here, and the actual value 5 gets sent over here. And notice I'm emphasizing that word actual because those are called actual parameters. Okay, that's the actual numbers that are the values that you're sending to the function. In comparison to, as I stated, formal parameters, which simply serve as placeholders to catch the values that you're sending to the function. So hopefully that's clear, formal versus actual parameters. Okay, so this is what I just explained. Oh, also it's important to note that I'm saying parameters. So here, yes, this list of values that we're sending over, X and Y, those values I'm sending over, those are called parameters. And so here within the function itself, those are called parameters, okay? So when you call a function, that function may have 0 or more parameters. Maybe it has no parameters. In fact, we can call the print function with 1 parameter inside, right? I can also call the print function with multiple parameters inside, as we just did, where I put comma end equals, and I put that second parameter with this end equals thing. I can also do a print function with no parameters. What if I just did that and I wanted to print a new line, right? So here we're sending a different number of parameters that are separated by commas. We sent 1 parameter here, then 2 parameters, and then no parameters. So these are called parameters. They're also called arguments. That's another term you'll see in textbooks. That so parameters versus arguments, those are used interchangeably. They're synonyms, okay? They're synonymous. So the word parameter, you could say the list of parameters, or you could say the list of arguments. So parameters being sent to a function are optional. It depends on your function. Maybe you want to print just a new line, so you don't actually send over parameters to the print function, okay? Maybe you want your function to do something special and it needs a lot of parameters. It really depends on the function. And then we have here the function body. This is where the function, the work of the function takes place. In this case, we were simply comparing, for this max function, we're comparing num1 versus num2. If num1 is greater than num2, we saved it into the value result. Else, if num1 was not greater than num2, we saved num2 into result. And on this particular example, we then had a return value, which I did not cover with that very extended trailer. But here we had a return value where this function is returning a value. In this case, it's returning result, which is the maximum value between num1 and num2. Okay, some functions will want to calculate something and then return that calculated value. Okay, so here we calculated, or we determined, which is the maximum value between num1 and num2, and we're then returning that value. Other functions will not return anything. It depends on the function. But in fact, Python has a stipulation which is different than other languages, which we'll cover later on that. Python actually always returns something. So what is a function? And in summary, it's a group of statements that are collected together to perform a certain task, okay? And what is the purpose of functions? Someone summarize for me. What is the purpose of functions that we've covered thus far?
To simplify code that's repeated.
Thank you. So Rebecca, I was about to say that you gave us a side effect or a side benefit of the value of functions, because you had stated to simplify code, which is a side effect and a value added benefit of functions. It certainly simplifies our code. So I was going to say that you gave us a side effect, okay, a value added benefit, but in fact, you then even said a second thing. And what was the second thing you mentioned? You said to simplify our code and to?
For repeated code?
Yep. You said to avoid repeated code. And that's really, if you were to summarize what is the purpose of functions, usually students, when I ask that on an exam, if I didn't like drill them towards the answer prior to the exam, usually students will say, well, the purpose is to simplify code. And that's a value added benefit. Absolutely. I remember when I was first studying, I used functions all the time because it made my code cleaner and easier to understand. But if we were to say, but what's the real value of functions and the purpose? And it's what you stated as the second thing, but you did mention both. And the second thing you stated, Rebecca, which is to avoid repeated code. So when you have redundant repeated code, that's when you should be sniffing out the use and the need for functions. So that's really our purpose. When we have repeated code, we should say, hey, let me go ahead, instead of repeating this code 7 times, let me just write it one time. Let's wrap it inside this function, and then I can call that function 7 times, right? Hopefully that makes a little bit of sense. So we put everything we want to do, this code that we want, we put that inside the function. And then how do we start that function? How do we call it? You already know the answer. We, such as the print statement, we type the actual name of the function and we can then call that function. Pardon me. So I'd like to come back and look at this sum number version 2. And I'm trying to close this. You can see my code, right? Confirm, please. Anyone? Nod, head nod.
Yes.
Thank you, sir. Okay, so here I'm going to once again save this. I'm going to call this version 3. And what am I going to do different? So here, noticed on this code, I called my function on its own line. So on line 23, after printing the sum from blank to blank is, I then called my function on its own line. And the reason I did that is because the sum that is calculated within this function, the result is I'm simply printing that sum. Okay, so I don't need this function to return anything. Like when I call the function and I do the task and I calculate the sum, I don't need anything special to get returned over to here. In fact, what is the result of line 23? If I could erase line 23, what's really happening as a result of line 23? Okay, what's happening as a result of line 23 is I am printing the sum from 1 to 10. That's really what happens, is I print the sum from 1 to 10. Now, you don't see the word print right here, right? It doesn't say print sum, right? You see sum numbers print. That's the name of the function. So we call the function, we calculate the sum, and we print it. So all we're really doing is printing on line 23. But what if now, instead of printing within our function, I'm going to show you how that function could have returned our sum. So notice, I'm just going to say return sum. Okay? So I'm saying return sum. So what happens now is this sum that is calculated, we calculate the sum. I think that's all clear for you. And then on line 18, once we call the function, we're going to then simply return that sum back over to whoever called it. In which case, we need to do something with it. Okay? So I'll show you the way that you would normally do this. It might look a little confusing, but here, I'm going to put this all in one print statement. I'm going to say the sum from blank to blank is blank, period. So now in this formatted printing statement, I have 3 placeholders, 1, 2, 3. And so inside the dot format, I need 3 placeholders. And I currently, inside the dot format, I only have 1, 2. What is the third placeholder going to be? Well, I could have done this. I could have said sum equals. This would be the easier way for, I think, new students to think about it. So I'll do it this way. I'll call it the sum, since sum is built in. Pardon me. So here, so I'm calling our function. Watch when I run this code. Let's do the first example. Oops, not run the code, debug the code. So when I debug this, again, Thani, it sees that we have a function. It gets num1 is n1 is 1, n2 is 10. Here we're calling this function. We're sending over 1 and 10. We get a pop-up window, okay? And I'm going to very quickly run through this. And let's see. So I is 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Look at the values of I changing at the bottom. 8, 9. Finally, I is 10. And sum is 55. And then notice it says return sum. So it's going to return this value 55. Okay, so I want you to realize, look at what's going on in the code. This is very important. Our main program, which is off to the left over here, what's it doing right now? What's it doing? Someone tell me. Anyone? As we're calculating all of this within this window, what is main effectively doing?
It's giving the sum the value, the sum of the numbers 1 to 10.
Well, yeah, this right here is we're calculating the sum within this function that I'm moving around. We're calculating the sum. But while we're calculating the sum within this function that I'm moving, what is main doing?
Receiving that value and saving it into the variable, the sum.
Well, but Ibrahim, I said while we're calculating the sum, while that is happening. So while we're actually doing this work over here, what is main doing? It can't be receiving it because we haven't calculated it yet. So while we're calculating it, what is main doing?
Nothing.
Nothing. And I'll even add I'll use a different word. Main is effectively just waiting. So this is what I want you to, the takeaway here, what's great on using Thani as this learning tool, is main is effectively, I'm moving my finger like a pause button. We don't have pause buttons anymore like that, but main is effectively on pause. When we called this function on line 22, we're coming over here to this function and main is on pause. It is waiting for that function to do its work. So think about it as the control of your program. The program control was over here. I'm going to stop this debugging. Let me hit stop. The program control, when I first start debugging right here, it's right here through our main program. N1 is 1, N2 is 10. The program control is within our main working program. But now on line 22, when I call some numbers of 110, program control, it leaves our main working program and it comes to this new function that we just opened up. So now main is on pause and I'm just calculating this function. I'm calculating sum within this function. So main is paused. Main is waiting for sum. Now look what happens. Now we're returning sum, which is 55. And where does that value 55 get returned to? We're returning it. So where does it get returned to? Can you guess, Sean? Mr. Thompson, Sean, can you guess where it gets returned to?
It gets returned to the sum.
Ah, perfect. Yeah, it gets returned to the sum. Well, that's where it's going to get saved in. And I'll even give you the exact detailed answer. Where does this return sum? So where does sum, right here it says return sum, where does sum get returned to? Well, think about it. It's going to get returned to whoever called this task, right? It's like if your parent says, hey, I need you to go out to the garage and get me, I don't know, something, get me the hammer. Okay, so you're the function, you go out to the garage and you get the hammer, and then, well, where do you return it to? Well, you're going to return it to whoever called you to do that work. So if you go return the hammer to your sister, then you failed as a function, right? So the function said, go out to the garage, get the hammer, and then bring it to your mom, right? So you go to the garage, you get the hammer, and you return it to the one who called you to do that work. So sum, watch what happens when I hit F7, 55 is going to get returned to precisely right here. That's where it gets returned. Why? Because that's who called the function. This right here, sum numbers print. We're calling this function sum numbers print with the numbers 1, 10. And we count, here's the function. We calculated 55. We're returning that answer. And where does it get returned to? It gets returned to right there. So notice when I now hit F7, it says return 55. Watch what happens. Come on. All of that became 55. All of that became 55. And then yes, Sean, 55 then gets saved into the variable, the sum. Okay, so that's why you notice here on the right side of the screen, you see the sum and you see the value 55. And then, yeah, we have simply formatted printing to go plug in those numbers. The sum from blank to blank is 55. Pardon me. So I think that's an easy way to understand it for new programmers. I will tell you, for more experienced programmers, what we'll even do, so what I wanted you to take away here, and I'll get to the more experienced programmers in just a moment, but as opposed to this example where we called, file open sum number 2, as opposed to this example where we called the sum numbers print on its own line, and the reason why we called it on its own line was because it was the result of that function was a print statement. So we wanted to effectively, we're printing on its own line. But now on this version, we're not actually printing anything inside this function. So in fact, how about we call it, I'm going to change the name, sum numbers return. I'm going to change the name, which means I need to change that, this, and this. So because we're actually just returning a value, we don't put it on its own line. Notice how this all right here, that function call with the values 1, 10, it became what? It became 55. That's what happened. So I want you to look at that carefully. I know I'm repeating this, like they say beating a dead horse, but this is very important to make sure you get that the result of this function, we called that function with the number 1. So N1 was 1, N2 right here was 10. We called over to that function, and the result of calling that function and doing the work was returning the number 55 right there to where we called the function, which then got saved into the sum. Okay? So because we did it that way, in fact, the way that we could do this once we were a little bit more comfortable with functions would be like this. Notice, oops, let me copy this print statement. So here we have 3 placeholders, right? N1, N2, and the sum. And instead of putting the sum right here, I'm going to directly, in the space of where that 3rd placeholder is going to go, I'm going to directly just put the call to the function. So that maybe looks weird for you, but that's actually what you'll commonly see. So let me just copy that entire print statement. So the sum from blank to blank is blank. So what goes in the first blank? N1. What goes in the second placeholder? N2. What goes into this 3rd placeholder? What goes in there is the result of this function, which we know is, I think it was 513 from 20 to 37, something like that. So what really is going there is the number 513, which then gets printed inside that placeholder. Okay, so when I finally run this, yeah, it was 513. That is functions. Someone do this. Let me ask the participants, raise your hand if you understand that everything we've talked about 100%. Like you have 100% perfect understanding of this, which you should not have unless you've studied this in depth before. Perfect understanding, like you'd be ready for an examination right now on everything we've covered. And I use those words because I don't want students to usually raise their hand unless it's perfect. Because if I say who understands, everyone raises their hand. So for the majority should not have raised their hand. And therefore, my request to you, think of something that you can ask me. something that's not 100%. Like, you understand what we covered, but maybe you understand it 95%. Or maybe it's just that it's so new you don't know what you don't know. So what is something that you think you understood it, but like 95%, 98%? What's that 2% gap? Can you think of any questions that would clarify this for you?
Does Python allow for the user to put their code for the definition of the function below the code in their main, kind of like Java does?
So instead of asking, why don't you try it?
Yeah, that would probably work.
What? Tell me.
I'll go do that.
So I bring this right here. So he's basically asking, can I take, let me zoom out some. Can I take that function that I had at the top, right? I had this function. He's asking, can I take that function there and basically put it down here? And let me come clear the output so you can see the result. And when I run it, you get, it's saying, uh-oh, some numbers, no, hold on a second. Some numbers return is not defined. And let's see where that error actually happens. When I run this code, we do this, and all of a sudden it sees that it's not defined because it goes in order, which, you have new programmers who often will put they want to put the main first in other languages and then they put the functions. But usually the correct programming style is to put all of your functions or methods first. If you do want to put them at the bottom, other languages like C, for example, a very well-known old language, you can put functions in C at the bottom, but what do you have to do? Does anyone know? What do you have to do if you want to put functions at the bottom in C?
I forget the exact syntax. We have to write a little line of code saying that, hey, there is a function. It's just down at the bottom.
You're basically writing the function header at the top. Like, you write the headers at the top on their own line to say, hey, here are my 5 functions. So you have just 5 lines, the 5 function headers. So the C compiler's not like going to be thrown off when it sees your main, because it does read everything in a consecutive order. So if you have main and then functions below it, when it reads these functions in main, these calls to functions, it would be confused. But by putting the information like the definitions or the headers at the top, that's how C did it. Here in Python, when we do this, it just straight up gives an error. So, which in a way I like, because Python tries to enforce good programming style. So yes, your function should be defined at the top of your program. Good question. Another question. You'll have opportunities to think of questions there. Any other questions? So here in our, let's see, what do we have? In our PowerPoint or PDF that you see online, we talked about the different ways you could call a function. So if your function was merely printing something, so here I'm going to come back to our module notes, which I haven't really put much in yet. So if your function was to call something, so if our function is simply printing something, then we can call it on its own line. Okay, so if I have define here simple function to print hello. Okay, so here define print simple message. Okay, I have no parameters, and inside here I just print hello, like I stated. Okay, and let's even put a new line afterwards. So that's our function. If our function is simply printing something, then I can just call it print simple message. I can call it on its own line. Okay, so we get that result, hello. Just like, and that works just like what I showed you earlier with our sum number version 2. Because the result of this function right here was simply that we're going to print the sum of those numbers from 1 to 10. Since the result of that function was really a print statement, we were able to put that function on its own line. But what the PDF is then explaining as well is that But when we're calling a function that's going to calculate and return an answer, so like we have on this example, where instead of printing the sum, we're returning the sum, then we actually would call that function almost like you see here as part of an assignment statement. Sorry, let me zoom in. So here we would call this function as part of an assignment statement. Why? Because the right side of this assignment statement is the call to the function, which results in that number 55, which then gets assigned into the variable the sum. Or on these other examples here, we could put the function call as wherever we're expecting that number to get returned back. So here we call this sum numbers return N1, N2, and the result is 513, which is exactly what I want right there within that formatted printing, because it should then come and 513 should come right there. So how you call a function, whether you call it on its own line, whether you call it as part of an assignment statement, or whether you call it maybe inside a print statement or inside a formatted printing, it really depends on what you're doing. If the function is not returning anything, but it's merely printing, that's when you normally just call the function on its own line like this, because it's going to print something, okay? So we showed you, we did the max function in multiple ways. I'm going to introduce the idea of a main function, but I want to get to a problem for y'all to do. We have less than 10 minutes and you've been listening to me too long. So I want to give y'all the problem to do, and then next time I'll get to main. So here, you know what, let me just explain main very briefly and hopefully 30 seconds. Can I do this in 30 seconds? Basically, now that we're defining functions, most other languages have a main. Okay, so most other languages have a function called main. Define main. And what does this function mean? Main is everything else for your program. So look at what I have here highlighted on lines. Basically, my whole program is lines 21 to 34. So I'm going to highlight those lines and tab them over. Now, all of those are part of my main function. So now look at all my code of this program. It's all within functions. So if I run it, I get nothing. Look at down at the bottom. When I run my code, I get no output because I'm not actually calling a function. How do I start my code now? And I'll cover this more next time, but how do I start my code right now? On line 36, what do I type? Take a guess. I can't hear you.
Main.
Yeah, I'm going to type main with parentheses. So 36 is saying, hey, go do your main function. And then on lines 14, we call the other function. So that is not enough of an explanation. I'll cover that more next time, but I want to give you all a problem to work on. And that problem is, you know what, I don't want to get cut off. It might take 10 minutes, so let's do this. Let me hit stop, and then I'll make, just click the join session again and come to the next session. And